All righty, I think you should be able to get going there. Go ahead, Grace.
Hi, everyone. My name is Grace, and I'm the events producer at University Bookstore in Seattle, Washington. I would like to welcome you to our event in celebration of Rough House, the new memoir by author Tina Ontiveros. Before I tell you more about Tina and this powerful book, I would like to thank you all for supporting a local independent bookstore. We're always grateful for your patronage, and especially now in this pandemic year where the fate of bookstores and all small businesses is uncertain. We're open to the public 12 to 4 Monday through Saturday and also offer curbside pickup. Tina Ontiveros is a writing instructor at Columbia Gorge Community College, book buyer at Clint's Booksellers, and president of the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association. Rough House is her first book. Tina was born into timber on both sides of the family. Her mother spent summers driving logging trucks for her family's operation, and her father was a son of an itinerant logger raised in a variety of lumber towns, as Tina herself would be. Rough House is a story of growing up in turmoil and recounts a childhood divided between a charming, mercurial, abusive father in the forests of the Pacific Northwest and a mother struggling with small town poverty. It is also a story of generational trauma, especially for the women, a story of violent men and societal restrictions, of children not always chosen and frequently raised alone. Just a few more things before we get started. We'll post the link to Rough House through the chat periodically, and all copies will include a signed bookplate, which Tina has sent over. The event is being recorded and will be on University Bookstore's YouTube channel in 2 to 3 days. If you have any questions for Tina, please put them in the chat field and we'll get to them at the end of the discussion. I'm joined in our talk today by University Bookstore's children's buyer, Renee Kirkpatrick, who has been corresponding with Tina about this book since its manuscript stages. And I think this is the first time they're actually meeting in person, even though it's virtually. So this is a really exciting time for both of them and us to be able to bring them together like this. So we're going to start off this evening with a brief reading by Tina from the book Rough House.
Thank you, Grace. Okay, hi guys. Let's see here. I think I'm just going to read you the first couple pages of my book, which is a story about my dad teaching me to ride a bike. By the way, my dad's called Loyd, so I call him Loyd in the book, and if you read the book, you'll learn why. I'm not sure I would define what Loyd did as teaching. What he did was dictate one day that I would not go inside to my mom, I would not eat or drink or pee until I rode that damn bike. He didn't offer many instructions. Like most lessons, Loyd taught with his body. He stood in the road holding a bike we'd borrowed from another family in his logging outfit. I stood beside him, looking up to his eyes. The world smelled like warm pine and dry dirt. I wore pink terry cloth shorts and a tank top striped in pastels. The neat pigtails Mom had put in that morning were now a wild mess around my dusted face. Get on the bike, Loyd said. Determined not to disappoint my dad, I threw a leg over the bike and slid my bony ass up onto the seat. Loyd bent behind me, his chest inches from my back, his arms around my own, and his feet firm on the ground to the left side of the bike. He gripped the handlebars on the metal part above my hands and started running. My heart thumped its way up my throat. At full speed, Loyd released the bike and yelled, "Pedal!" My feet got tangled or couldn't find the pedals, or I froze every time. I fell sideways, scraped away another part of myself. Loyd jogged over, picked up the bike, and leaned it toward me. Get on the bike. This process repeated as the day expanded out, its boundary somehow stopping the forward motion of time. I asked for a Band-Aid for my knee because it never had a chance to stop bleeding before hitting the ground again. Loyd said no. You can have a Band-Aid when you ride the goddamn bike. Get on the bike, change to get on the goddamn bike. Pedal, change to pedal, goddammit. My cheeks burned, and not just because of the July sun. I felt like the whole trailer park was watching, other kids peeking out from behind the trunks of Doug firs to witness my humiliating failure. Pure metallic hate for my dad slid around my heart. I was sure it would become solid and forever. The road was paved but breaking up and rutted, covered in scree. After each fall, I stole a few moments to pluck gravel from my skin and try to look pathetic before Loyd urged me back onto the bike. My palms and knees stung from smacking down on the road. What began as physical pain traveled inside my body and turned to burning thoughts. I wanted Loyd to be wounded as I was, wished for the strength to make him feel stung, but that was before I actually pedaled. When I landed my feet on both pedals and felt myself pushing that bike forward, the cloud of anger and shame cleared away. I was riding that goddamn bike. My exhaustion evaporated and pedaling came as natural to me as running. The bike was an extension of my body. I understood why Loyd smiled like an idiot when he leaned his own bike into a slow, wide turn and called out for my big brother Jesse to follow. Until this moment, I'd always stood at the edge of our patch of grass and watched them ride together. But now Loyd was standing and watching me. Now I was riding. Loyd whooped his joy. "Well, I'll be damned," he yelled. "That's it, honey, you got it. Sure as shit." This time, I didn't mind that the whole neighborhood might hear. It was like there was this whole other Tina I didn't even know existed. This Tina could power a mighty machine and get places fast. She could escape bad guys or rob a gas station or win a race, who knows? All I knew for sure was that I was going to ride that bike until dark and maybe even after. Never mind the trickle of blood down my shin or the raging thirst that moments ago I thought would kill me. Now I thrust through the warm evergreen air. I created the breeze that dried my sweat and made my scalp tingle, and I liked it. Love for my daddy swelled in my chest, which made me even lighter, faster. Love for the salty tears on my face, love for the sting of my scrapes. I knew Loyd had given me a new sort of magic, power. Then he barked out at me again. "Sweetheart, get inside and get cleaned up. You look like hell."
Thank you, Tina. And congratulations on publishing your memoir this year. This has been a difficult year in book publishing just because a lot of the author tours were canceled and ways that we've done things for decades have changed drastically. What was it like having your book come out during this pandemic year and to go on virtual book tours?
Yeah, that's a good question. And like I have nothing to compare it to, but
That is true. This is all brand new to you. So it is your reality.
yeah, I guess I know though, as a person who ran events at a bookstore for a long time, how different things are. And I have to say, for me, it really works. I don't think I would have been able to do nearly as many bookstore visits as I've done if they weren't on Zoom, because I didn't have to travel for them all. I mean, I think at first I was kind of like, oh, this is a bummer. I was looking forward to like coming to see you guys and we could have dinner or something, you know, like I have a lot, because of my role as a bookseller, I have a lot of friends at bookstores all across the region. So
Right.
It sounded very fun to see my friends, but then the idea of actually like standing in front of a room of people, or as you guys know, as booksellers, a room where no people come.
That is true.
Like that, you know, that I can make my mom come to every Zoom event, right?
Speaking of audience, like I obviously do events for our bookstore too. And one of the things that this has done is opened up our viewership to a huge community. People from all over the world have attended some of our events. Have you been meeting some of your fans from places that you thought you'd never ever be going to visit in person? Or
I wouldn't say I have fans at this point, but maybe.
Oh, I think you have fans.
I've definitely been, I think so. I think, yes, I think there are people here tonight who otherwise would have never even made an event. There are people who are coming to multiple events who were able to connect with the book because of a Zoom event like this. And then now maybe we correspond and, you know, I hear about their life story and the book they wish they could write. And so there's definitely connections. Or I've been able to do events. I've done a lot of events with other authors, as like, instead of being in conversation with somebody from the bookstore, I'm in conversation with an author. And that's like, there are people I would have never been in the same event with if it weren't for this.
Right.
So that's been kind of amazing.
And so from what you read to us, this is obviously a very personal book to you and sometimes shares a lot of painful and intimate memories. When did you decide that you were ready to tell your story to the world or share your story with the world? And was it difficult to find the strength to be so vulnerable and to, because you share a lot of yourself, you don't hold back. And I think that's what makes your book so, touching to all of us who've read it, that you really share yourself with us. So where did you find the strength and how did you decide you were ready to do that?
Well, I think if you read Rough House, you know that there are some very strong women who raised me, in particular, my mom and my stepmother, who were both people who, literally put their physical bodies between me and physical harm. And I think when you have lived that way and you've experienced that, it makes other things less scary.
Yeah.
but on the flip side, no, I think we all carry shame around our family secrets, and I'm no exception. Like, it was definitely, I said the other night, somebody asked me a similar question, and I said, well, before I wrote it, it was writing me. Like, every decision in my life was probably a result of me trying to not deal with my trauma. And
you also talk about your family in this. Have they read the book?
Yes.
Okay, what are their thoughts? Have you been getting feedback on that?
Yes. So actually, I didn't write the book to be published. So maybe that's something a lot of people, and I think Renee knows that because Renee first encountered the manuscript because we have a mutual friend who had asked me to read it. I wrote the book because I was getting an MFA, and I got an MFA because I wanted to teach at my community college. I had only been able to move out of poverty because I was able to take a class at a time at community college and pay for it, and then eventually transfer. And, I got my entire college education while raising children. So I wanted to go back to grad school so that I could teach, and if I could get into an MFA program, right? If I could get into one, there are a lot of really great low residency programs, so that would allow me to still parent and work and keep my obligations. And so I thought, oh, MFA, great! It's a terminal degree. I still get my master's. I can teach at the college. I just have to write a book,
Just write a book. That's all.
That's all. And so I decided, that certainly isn't the only reason I decided, but this book had been sort of popping out of me in little ways, in free writes and writing classes for years and years and years. But it was always a story that maybe I'd read it in class, but never take it any further than that. And it was also always the story that every teacher was like, you need to write that story, but I kept trying to cram it back down. But when I went to grad school, I thought, Tina, that's what you need to do. I'd tried to write so much bad fiction before. And I mean, it was okay, but I could.
And there is a place in the world for bad fiction.
Yes,
there is.
But mine wasn't the kind of bad fiction you want to read. No, I'm just kidding. I'm probably being a little hard on myself, but it was fine, but it wasn't exactly what I should have been doing. I know I was hiding in that work, definitely. So I thought, well, maybe if I get into a graduate program, I might write this book, because first of all, I thought it would be a huge challenge, because the only memoir I like is memoir that reads like a novel. Mm-hmm. I wanted to use the tools of fiction to write an engaging story, to make sure there's setting and turning people into characters, including myself, which is a lot of work. So that was all I just thought it would be a really interesting challenge to write nonfiction for my MFA thesis. And so this book started as my MFA thesis. And as far as being vulnerable, I mean, that's a whole nother question. It's a lot easier to write it when you tell yourself you're not going to publish it. You have permission to tell the truth and to just let the story be what it needs to be. And then, but then I think going back to those women who raised me, so many women that I grew up with and was raised by, they really suffered so much more than I ever did. And I felt like if the small bit I can do is sort of carry the weight of the story into the world, they actually carried the most brutality in that situation. So I can be the, like, hold the weight of being the face of that by sharing this story. And also, frankly, just going to college, getting out of poverty. Like, those are two huge things. When you're no longer poor and when you're educated, or at least for me, I shouldn't say for anybody else, I was able to set down that shame. You know, you kind of start to see it for what it is. And that would definitely set me free to share this story.
Well, we're all really glad that you did share the story and that the book did go on to be published, because as you mentioned, if everyone keeps quiet about these things, no one ever grows or learns from that. And so I'm really, we're all grateful that you put your story out there for us. And speaking of manuscript, which you mentioned, I think this is a great time for you and Renee to tell us a little bit about how you met, because you met over this book. And for a lot of people who are not in the book industry, I think it's just a great story of how things work. And from all that time ago, when I think, Renee, you said that you were only just holding a bunch of papers that were just printed from someone's printer, and now we have a published book. And so that's a great story too. So do you both mind talking a little bit about that with us?
No, I don't mind.
I'd love to hear how you first encountered it, Renee.
Well, I'll tell you, Curtis is a good bookseller, and he knows his audience. I'll tell you, it's like we're sitting there talking. He's got his computer out there, and he's typing in the order, and he just sort of stops and he says, I can't tell you about it yet because it's not even out. I can't even talk about it. No, what, Curtis? Well, I know this author. Well, she's not an author yet. She's written a book. And I'll tell you, just that alone just dragged me right in. He said, I think you'd have a lot in common with her. She grew up a lot like you did. And mine was at two opposite ends of my life. Your whole story was at opposite ends of my life. But she grew up in the woods in a logging town like you did. And I said, well, and tell me more. So you told me a little bit about your dad's story and your relationship. And I thought that was my relationship with my uncle. I couldn't trust him. But I loved him.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that? I was always worried that I was going to do something terribly wrong. So I was very, very careful with everything I did. Didn't help. I got beat one time, and I didn't go much farther out of and I did it for something I thought was right. I mean, I got beaten because of something I did that I thought was right. And, you're the only people I've ever told, you and the rest of the audience out there. It's so bizarre. But your story mirrored mine so much. I mean, even the bike ride, learning how to ride a bike, that's how I learned to ride a bike. And it was painful, but I finally learned how to ride a bike, and I went off to college and I got my degree in education. So, I mean, thank you, Curtis. I mean,
yeah.
he was just like, I don't know, this book right here is so amazing. I just want everybody in the world to read it, because I think there are more of us out there than we will ever know. And we're all a little bit ashamed about how that happened. Was it my fault?
Yeah.
Did I do something wrong? And
right.
we don't. And yet we still love these people. I mean, Loyd's an amazing character. He really does love you kids. At least it seems like it from what you're reading. And then it's like,
absolutely did. And what you're saying just hits home, Renee. It's like Renee there's no other reality for Renee. There's no other reality for Tina, right? This is and I remember your blurb when you wrote, no matter where you are, family is family is family. Family makes us who we are. And I don't want to put the blame outward, because I know I participate in this. We as a society, we do really shame kids. We teach kids that shame, I think, for the troubles of their families. And first of all, like you said, it's so much more universal than anybody wants to admit. But secondly, like, what good is that shame doing? What work is it doing on anybody's behalf? Like, I don't know that it does anybody any good, you know?
Mhm.
So I don't know. I think Curtis had such a, so just for the people watching who don't know this, I don't even know if Curtis is here, but Curtis is a mutual friend of ours who we both worked with in the book industry. And yeah, he had reached out to me because he had just heard people chatting about the fact that I had this manuscript. I don't even remember how he knew, because I don't think I told him, because at this point I wasn't sure I wanted to publish it. I had given it, to answer Grace's earlier question, I had given it to my mom and brother and said, here's this thing. People might seem like they're sniffing around, maybe a little interested in it, but I would never ever do anything with it if you guys aren't okay with that. So read it, tell me what you think, no pressure at all. And my brother is the world's slowest reader. So my mom had it done in like a weekend, you know, and she's like, it made me cry and it's sad, but it's so important. And I think it should be in the world and, you know, blah, blah. Like she was just totally on board, but I had to wait for my brother. It took him like a month. Sorry, I got up on a tangent there, but I'm getting back to this Curtis thing. Yeah. So they had it while Curtis asked for it. And Curtis was just sort of like, Tina, if you're comfortable, we should do something with this. And I was like, you know, I'm not at all uncomfortable. Once you've workshopped, like I had workshopped a lot of the pieces in the book, and I had just kind of gone through this process. It started as stories from my life. And then by the time I was done, it was a made thing. You know, it was a thing that I had worked over and crafted so much that I was able to stand outside of it and not feel deeply emotional about the idea of publishing it. Although, Renee, I will tell you, there are some parts I will never read at a reading. There are parts I have never spoken out loud. So the first people to hear them is like everyone in the world who reads this book, right? So I know exactly what you mean. And for me, writing my way out of that, you know, Rebecca Solnit says writing is a way of she says something like of saying, when you can't say something to someone, it's a way to say something to everyone. And I just kept thinking of that, like, well, I guess I'm saying this to everyone. I think for me, the entire process has been like, Tina, just take the next step. And I got to say, this is something I learned from my dad. Like, he just always, despite all Loyd's faults, he always got up and just tried again. He kept falling off the wagon, and then he's going to try again, and he's going to try again to start that new life. He's going to go back and start studying with the Jehovah's Witnesses, or, you know, he's going to try to get good with the Lord again and all of that. And I think I took that with me, because I just kept like, don't think about whether this will really be a book. Just take the next step. Don't think about this being a book. Take the next step.
Well, I am so thrilled you took that next step. I mean, I think it's a really, really important book. I think more people need to read it than they think they do.
Thank you.
You know, it is, we've all got some little piece of that in us somewhere where it's never seen the light of day.
Yeah.
And I think it wears away at people. And the moment they can get the sunlight in there, I mean, thank you. I've never ever said any of this to anybody except my husband before.
Thank you.
So it's like, you in the world. Well, except for maybe Curtis. Maybe I told him that little piece too.
Well, I told Curtis, maybe Renee needs to write a book.
I'm just going to cross your name out of this one and put mine on top.
You have my permission.
But, you know, those logging towns, they are amazing places.
Yeah.
And, you know, and anytime you live in a small place like that too, you find those people who truly do have your back, regardless of what's going on, you know, who always come up with a couple of bucks to get a bread for your family because you can't do it this month, you know, and some of those people are.
Everyone knows everyone.
Yep.
And, you know, and my dad.
And they know all the secrets.
Exactly.
Even though they don't say anything about it.
You know, my dad was always, part of his cycle was that, you know, he would burn bridges and move on to a new town. So he was always in different places, although he did return to a lot of the same towns over and over again. But wherever he was, I always knew I could just show up in town and go to like the gas station or the cafe and just be like, hey, do you guys know where Loyd is? And maybe somebody would be like, Loyd, and I'd be like, Loyd and Linda, he's a logger, you know, she might work, if there's a cafe around here, she probably works there. And they'd be like, oh, Loyd and Linda, yeah, you know, drive out here and take a left there. And, you know, like, I always sent my dad mail general delivery. He never had an address.
Tina, you found a lot of sanctuary in the beauty of nature around you. Renee, did you also, was that a big part of your growing up too? Can you both speak a
Always.
little bit about, what brought you comfort during your childhood?
Do you want to go first, Renee?
Well, yeah, I'll do that. Where all of this happened was on, we called it the old farmhouse. It was an old house on the top of the hill, out in the way back country. This is in Oregon, and we always had horses, and so I spent most of my time just sitting on a horse, letting it go wherever it wanted. I don't think I often used a bridle, and we never used saddles, at very least, and never a saddle. And just let the horse wander around. Then again, we also, in the fall, we hunted, and the kids all went out, and we're the ones that beat the brush for the pheasant and for all of those little animals that skitter out of the dirt when kids come kicking through the grasses. And those gunshots went off over our heads. Didn't even think that maybe that wasn't such a good idea. But yeah, we were surrounded by nature when I was growing up. And then of course, living in my hometown when I was later in the logging town. I don't know if I should mention the name, but
You don't have to.
okay, Southern Oregon. And there is nothing like being on the Southern Oregon coast.
Oh yeah.
In a logging town. I mean, even with all and standing up and doing that arm motion for the truckers. And they always honk.
Yeah, they do. It's so true. Oh my gosh, I totally forgot about that. Yeah. Every time my dad would be like, kids, and we don't. Totally, I know what you mean. Yeah, there's like a weird. It's like a different communication. The first time last week I did an event at King's Books in Tacoma for Lydia Valentine's new poetry collection. And the first time I met Lydia, she said to me, I knew we should be friends because you're a code switcher. And I was like, what? Code switcher? I'm like a white lady from a small town. She was like, yeah, but you change your language depending on who you're talking to. And I realized she was totally right. And I think it's that, like what you're describing with this and everything, like there's a different way I spoke when I was with my dad.
Mm-hmm.
And I always imagine, I know it didn't happen like this, but I imagine that dramatic night that we fled him, I always imagine like my mom furiously driving away and at one point me saying something that included like the word ain't, and my mom turning around and saying, ain't is not a word. Because like as soon as we left, she understood how even just the way you speak is a marker in society. And so she was always kind of correcting our, don't say ain't, Jesse and me. We always had to say Jesse and I. And to the point where I would say it even when it was incorrect. Or write it even when it was incorrect. And, there's just like my dad had this way of speaking that I was really trying to capture when I wrote the book. Like he had, like I think of like the kind of cliches of AA, which was a big part of his life, and how they're so comforting to me and felt like poetry to me, like the most beautiful language in the world. And I think for a lot of years when I was a young adult, I was very judgmental and harsh toward my dad and everything that had happened, and toward like AA. I felt like it was just another addiction that he, whenever he wasn't using, he had AA. But now I've come to this place where I feel like there's something really beautiful about this idea that you kind of surrender to this idea that you're not that special, that there are a million other drunks just like you or whatever, you know what I mean? Like and this idea that your story is just not that special, but it is that special. But it's in the shared parts that make it special. And I think it was a big thing for me to try to resist trying to sound too clever or smart in the book, and trying to keep that kind of humble language, and also be honest about the kind of cliched way my dad would speak, which was an important part of the way we communicated, and so changing it to make myself seem more hip or clever just would have felt like a sort of a betrayal.
Well, but your book, because it's written the way it is so accessible to us all, and that's that's the beauty of it. I mean, this is our story. This
Yeah.
is a lot of our story right here. It's and we weren't beautifully written when we were young, you know.
Right.
So I just it is. Thank you.
Yeah, and that was big for me. I told myself if Loyd was alive, I'd want him to feel this was an approachable book.
Mhm.
And maybe it would get hard for him part of the way in, you know, and that's just the way it is, especially that center chapter is written very differently than all the other chapters. And it's definitely more of my adult voice and more of me trying to use words that have been carefully placed to try to sort of try to represent what it is like when you process trauma. And you know, it's the only place in the book where I really step out into third person and I'm like, she this, she that, because it's like even I need that distance from that, you know, and I'm trying to be like, this is how you process this kind of trauma. And but the rest of it I think is really approachable, and that's on purpose. Like I wanted to know that he would be able to read it. Yeah, I remember once I was always showing up at his house with books. And he goes, oh, what are you reading, honey? You know, and he would always say to me, I would be like, well, what are you reading, Dad? And he's like, well, Daddy's not book smart like you are. And he told me once the only thing he really enjoyed reading, you know, he would read the Bible when he was trying to study with the witnesses. He would read the big blue book of AA. But otherwise, he liked to buy every now and again as a treat. He'd buy himself a copy of the Reader's Digest. But he would not read the whole thing. There was just every time there would be this one story that was like true stories that they would put in the Reader's Digest. It was always like an exciting story of somebody surviving some crazy like boat crash or getting stranded up on a mountain or a plane crash or some crazy adventure that somebody would survive. And they were true stories. And he was like, now Daddy likes them true stories and Reader's Digest. And they were written for like a 3rd to 5th grade reading level. Because I remember I would read them and be like, this is so easy, you know, because I thought it was so smart. And so I thought, you know, I want it to feel like an invitation if he were to open it up and try to read it. Of course, I'll never read it, but that was the idea. So I'm glad you noticed.
So I think this would be a great time to do another little reading from the book. And while Tina is doing that as well, I'm just going to remind everyone in the audience, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and we will we'll get to those questions right after the reading.
Okay, so this is a reading by request for my friend Abby, who's in the audience tonight. And she keeps asking me to read the Cabbage Patch story from the book, but it's just way too long for a bookstore reading. But since this is my last stop on my tour, you guys. So yeah.
Well, we're glad you're here with us.
Yes.
My goodness.
It's pretty exciting. So I thought I should try to, since Abby comes to every single event, I wanted to try to read for her. So I tried to pull a little piece out of the Cabbage Patch Kids story. You don't get the whole story.
You got it in the book, though.
Yeah, that's right. By the way, you can find out whether she gets the Cabbage Patch. But this is a story of a time that my brother and I were living at our dad's, and he did something particularly horrible. Frankly, I'm remembering now that Pam was quite mad at me for writing this particular story in the book. So maybe it's better that she's not here tonight, because I'm referring to that thing my dad did, which Pam finds so horrible. So Loyd had behaved badly. And so our mom was coming to pick us up, and we were going to go back to live with her. And right before we left, right before she came for us, he told us he was going to take us to Kmart and let us each spend $100, which was like a really big deal to us. So this is just a little piece of that story. When it was about time to go back home to Mom, Loyd took us to Kmart and told us we could each pick one thing that cost $100 or less. Even though I was getting old enough to know this wasn't right, that he didn't help Mom with money but could buy us unnecessary toys, I wasn't going to pass up the opportunity. Going to Kmart and spending $100 was the sort of thing we saw in movies. This was little orphan Annie and Daddy Warbucks territory. We were helpless to resist such luxury. When you imagine a poor kid, you might picture a scrappy but responsible and selfless character like little orphan Annie. That's not what I was like. Most of the time I was a selfish little jerk. My siblings and I would fight like dogs over small things, each desperate to get the largest piece of whatever good thing came our way. As a treat, Mom sometimes bought us sweet cereal, like the generic versions of Captain Crunch or Fruit Loops, that came in a bag instead of a box, like dog food. Getting candy cereal was like a holiday. We'd get up early and eat it until we were sick, just to hog as much as possible before our siblings could. Mom made a rule that we could each only have one bowl per day. Jessie used a mixing bowl, pouring in nearly the entire bag at once. I had a secret habit of binging on children's Tylenol because I thought it tasted like candy. As a hospital employee, Mom got a discount if she bought them in big boxes, like at the doctor's office. Each dose in a tiny packet, foil inside, white paper outside. Mom noticed they were disappearing, but none of us confessed. She sat us down for a lecture on the danger of taking too much medicine and hid the box. I tried hard to resist, but they were so delicious. I found myself sneaking around until I found them in her closet. I think the foil packets were meant to be childproof, but I used her fingernail clippers to get them open. I decided 5 at a time was probably not going to kill me. It felt like a conservative number. As soon as the first one hit my tongue, I was thinking about the next. I could only enjoy the chalky tang for a brief second before I was anxious about it being gone. Sometimes I couldn't help myself and ate 6 or 7, then worried myself sick, thinking I might die from it. When I was done, I'd go to the kitchen trash can, lift out some garbage, and stash the Tylenol packets underneath. I'm sure my siblings had similar secrets. We had appetites. We wanted stuff. When Loyd took us to Kmart, I was faced with a crisis of identity. It was the sort of occasion where your true colors are forced to shine. Jessie knew we should get bikes. We were in charge of getting ourselves to school and were always wishing we had bikes to ride in the morning. Mom couldn't afford new bikes, so we'd scrapped ours together by taking apart old bikes and parts we'd found at High Dollar John's. Well, Jessie did anyway. Grandpa Pothead owned a junkyard called High Dollar John's. Owned is a stretch. He rented a bunch of land down by the railroad tracks at the east end of the Dalles and traded in junk there. He helped pay the bills by renting out beds in the abandoned trailers scattered around the property. He charged homeless men $1 a night for a bed, which might mean there'd be 2 or 3 guys in a trailer at once. No water, no sewer, no power. There were chickens scratching around the junkyard, and it smelled like rancid oil and rust. Pothead let Jessie dig around for parts to cobble together bikes, but they were pretty crappy. They were always losing pieces and in need of tweaking, so we didn't rely on them to get us to school. When we walked into Kmart, Jessie assumed we were both on the same page. He went straight for the bike section, and I knew he was right. There they stood, lined up in a neat row, every piece of them brand new and in working order, every kind and color we could want, bright banana seats, BMX knockoffs. Jessie started test driving and I felt sick to my stomach. He looked at me, eyebrows pulled together, and told me which bike I should try first. Maybe he thought I was overwhelmed by my options. It's true I had no idea how to pick out a new bike, but that was not the holdup. I wanted a Cabbage Patch Kid. I wanted to keep up with the other girls at school, and a bicycle wasn't going to help me do that. Every girl that mattered had at least one Cabbage Patch Kid. Some had several. Some had whole trunks of clothing and accessories. I only wanted one with her carefully selected eye color and hair color, her factory prescribed name, and most intriguing, her official adoption papers. A Cabbage Patch Kid meant social acceptance for me, and I was pretty sure this was my last chance to get one.
Tina, thank you. Your writing is phenomenal, by the way. we could sit here and listen to you for hours, but we do have a question, and I think it's from Abby. Let's see. So education was a big part of your journey out of poverty. Building relationships with people outside of your socioeconomic station was another. Can you talk about that?
Abby, I think I know what you mean. And I think maybe, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I think for me doing that was part of running away from where I came from. So, and actually when I met Abby, who asked this question, is because we both had children who were getting ready to go into school, and she kind of invited, like she was the first other parent that I knew. And you're right, like we both sort of ended up at this small school where there were a lot of people that were definitely not from, I remember taking my son to kindergarten, and I had been so nervous to make sure that he had clothes without any holes and that everything was, that he looked, you know, very tidy. And then I bring him, and I'm by far the youngest parent there. And all these other moms are amazing women. Maybe some of them are here tonight, but, you know, definitely, like, I had other moms in this class who were like, there was a lawyer, there was a doctor, and I was just like in awe of these amazing women who had like real careers. And I hadn't even, you know, I was taking a class at a time at the community college. But I remember looking around and noticing, like, I have a friend, a really neat lady who writes to me about my book a lot now, who's now a judge. And she wrote to me the other day, and I told her, I remember that first day of kindergarten that my son, here he was, yeah, I made sure he was all dressed, and then her son had like holy pants, and, you know, he just, his hair, like, he had the big hair sticking up all over the place, like he just rolled out of bed. And I think that's definitely, I don't know exactly what your question is, Abby, but I think it's definitely it helped me develop my voice as a writer, and it helped me come to terms with some of the shame of poverty, because I think the more time you spend in the middle class, the more you recognize that there's very little different about us. And that, you know, I've said before in other events that in my time in the middle class, I've seen lots of families with very similar substance abuse problems to my family. They just don't suffer the same consequences because of their social safety net and because of their wealth. And so I think if I didn't have those relationships, I wouldn't know that. I wouldn't have come to know that.
While you were writing this book, Tina, you had to spend a lot of time kind of dissecting your past and going over all of those little details. Now that you're an adult, how have you looked back? Like, how do you look back on your childhood, and have the memories that you thought you had, did they change a little bit as you looked back? How is that process for you?
I think that I can't speak for anybody else, I guess, but I definitely tell my students when they're trying to write about their childhoods that, you know, there are certain memories that for whatever reason are just very strong for you. And I always tell them to start with those. And, you know, I try to be really careful in the book. I don't know if you guys remember this, but toward the beginning, there are a couple of times where it says, you know, this is imperfect memory. I can't say that I know this from like this sort of verbatim picture perfect memory, but there are certain things I know kind of by osmosis, like not just from my family environment and from the stories you hear that are passed down, and then your own memory, and you're kind of cobbling all of that together. But it is hard. I didn't collect stories from other people when I was writing the book because I felt like I needed to try to I wanted to be the only person responsible for whatever I was exposing in this book. And so to me, it was an important balance of, I was just reading Billy Ray Belcourt's book about, you know, he's got his memoir that's like a collection of essays. And there's a point in there where he says something about like how his commitment to veracity isn't always the most important thing, because sometimes it's his commitment to beauty or the way that he's, you know, putting this story together. And so I tried to kind of strike a balance with that. There are a couple things that I've learned. Definitely when I gave my mom and brother the manuscript, I was like, if anything's totally wrong, I need to know. And there was one story in there that was just my memory of it was totally wrong.
Would you share that with us? Or
I had resolved the story differently than it really happened. So like there's this scene in my book where my dad held a gun to my brother's head. And it was one of those stories that I had kind of overheard the whisperings of so many times that I thought the way it looked in my head was the way it happened. But in fact, it happened quite differently. I was kind of mixing together violent episodes. So, you know, I definitely was like, tell me if anything's totally wrong. And my brother was like, you know, even the things that I feel like I remember the details a little differently, it feels like it's not wrong. It's just the way you saw it. So, you know, you try to tell the truth.
We have another question from the audience from Genevieve. Hi, Tina. Is there anything you left out of your story that you wish you had included?
Sometimes I kind of wish, so I cut, this book has had at least 400 pages. Like I cut a lot. And there were a lot of chapters I wrote or stories that I wrote that I thought were going to fit into the story and then they didn't. But I think most of them had to go. I'm pretty savage when it comes to cutting my writing. But when I made the decision to end the book where it ends, which is at my dad's funeral, or what we would call a funeral, it was a very backwoods DIY job. When I made the decision to end the book there, it meant cutting off a couple of stories about me raising my kids, which were there to sort of show the ways that I had carried some of Loyd's behavior, both bad and good, into my own life. And sometimes I wish I had found a way to keep those, but still stop the story where it stops. But it just wasn't working, because I feel like I almost want, anytime I'm writing nonfiction, I always tell my students, if you can't tell who the asshole in the room is, it's you. And I always feel like if you're going to write something like this and you're going to expose people, like the biggest jerk should be me, and that's really hard when you're keeping yourself in the child's perspective, because of course I don't believe children are responsible for their abuse, but so I wanted to have those stories to kind of put a little culpability on myself and show the imperfect ways that I sort of carried some of Loyd's anger into particularly my young adulthood, but they just didn't work once we decided to end the book where we ended it. So
I think that you're probably going to write a second part to this memoir, just talking about those ramifications of, how your childhood affected you going forward, that kind of thing.
I don't see myself writing like a continuation of Rough House. I do have another project I'm working on. I have 2 projects that I'm working on that I think might end up being book length. One of them is the same time period, only the kind of small town poverty in the Dalles, which was very, very different. And life with my mom and the ways she navigated being a single parent and the many kind of predatory men that were in our vicinity during those years. And that one's a little harder. A lot of those people are more still connected to my family and stuff. So there's that. And then I've also been working on a little essay collection. So I put out an essay last year that's at Oregon Humanities about my sister, and sort of she's the one of the 3 of us who has not made it past the federal poverty line. And I've definitely been noticing the ways that, a lot of her struggles are, we want to blame people when they fail to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And again, I'm back into that point of like, I don't know who that blame is benefiting, but it's certainly not benefiting those of us who are enjoying a more comfortable life. It's certainly not benefiting those who are not, and it's really harming the children of those who are not. And so I'm feeling really compelled by those stories right now, but I'm very careful about it too, because my sister is very much living that right now, and I don't ever want to expose her in any way that makes her feel uncomfortable. She's totally told me to talk about this, like I make sure everything's okay with her before. But I'm just very concerned with the ways the world is harming my nieces right now, and the way the world is harming my nieces simply because their mom is poor.
That's an important story to tell.
Yeah.
So you're working on those 2 projects right now. Have you been finding that, a lot of people have been talking about how during the pandemic, they just haven't been able to concentrate on reading or writing. Have you found that to be the case for you, or are you reading more than ever now?
I was reading more than ever, but I'm also teach. I have 56 students this term.
So, oh, wow.
So what I've been reading, in the last 6 or 8 weeks, I've mostly been reading work by my students or work that I assign to my students. I've been reading a lot of essays and, short nonfiction pieces. But yes, I've been doing quite a bit of reading.
What are you reading right now, or what have you been reading this year?
I just started that book, Miracle Country. It's a memoir by Kendra. I can't think. Atlee Wood, maybe. I'm so sorry. I should have had that on deck.
That's okay. Our behind the scenes tech producer might be able to go look this up really quickly.
It's called Miracle Country. It's a memoir. And then my students and I read this last week, and that I'm really into nonfiction right now. So my students and I read Miriam Gerba has this amazing short memoir piece. Of course, I'm not going to remember the title. Maybe one of my students is in the audience. It's like The Lost Women Who Haunt Me. And it's kind of a braided piece about her own brush with a man in her neighborhood who later killed another girl. And and it's just a really amazing piece. Lydia Yuknovich has a short braided memoir piece called Woven that's really amazing. What else have I been reading lately? Oh, Melissa Febos.
Oh, look, there's the link to Miracle Country in chat.
You guys,
thank you, Mystery University Bookstore person.
Yeah, read that. That's a beautiful book. So, and then I'm working on Jess Walters. I just started Jess Walters' new book, but first I need to finish Willie Loughton's new book. So the thing about Willie, I'm like, Willie, sometimes these poor people are happy, you know. It's so sad, but I love his books. I really, really like his work. So I was very excited to get an advanced copy of his new book.
Have you always liked memoir, or have you found a new, so it's as you were writing, you have discovered a new appreciation for it?
Yeah, I was a big memoir reader. It's so weird. And I studied a lot of memoir when I was writing the book, just to kind of decide what I thought was working for me as a reader and what I thought wasn't. And I think sometimes memoir writers feel like they have to put everything in, and so it can be sort of a slog to get through. But I'm definitely, like, this Melissa Febos essay that I was just talking about has me on this new kick about how, like, very often there's sort of there's a bias against memoir, and I think in many ways it's because it's considered women's work. And that's definitely something Febos talks about, is like, you know, who was that guy that wrote the Four Seasons? Oh gosh, you guys know because you sold it. Knausgaard. Yes. Okay. Remember his books? They're like 4 memoirs, like this fat.
Yeah. Yes. My Struggle.
Yeah. My Struggle. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's very, I read the first one. There's some beautiful writing in there, but it's very like about this one dude, right? Right.
Yes, it is. It is just every single thing about him.
Like, and you can spend like 4 hours hearing about like his elbow or something. And Melissa Febos says in her essay, she's like, it's funny when men write memoir, it's like, ooh, literary genius.
Right.
But then women write it, it's like, quit navel gazing, quit worrying about your trauma. Of course, Melissa Febos says it much more eloquently than that. But she says, we'll stop talking about it when you stop doing it to us.
Yeah, it's true.
Nailed it, sister. So I really recommend that essay.
Have your students read your book?
Yeah, I'm definitely starting to get students who are like, oh my gosh, and I had one write me. She was at an event last week, and then she didn't feel brave enough to ask a question at the event. And then she sends me this email that's just like really long, and it's all these questions. And I was like, girl, you asked me that at an event. I told her we'll sit down and talk sometime. But I was like, if I answer you these questions, I'm just going to be rewriting the book. Like, it's a really long. But yeah, I'm definitely getting. And my favorite is when I get students. I teach like Writing 90, which are students who are facing a lot of. Usually students who face a lot of barriers to get into college, and as I did. And that group, there's always just students who really remind me of myself. And I was really excited because I never push the book on students. I don't really say much about it, you know, so if they hear about it, great. But I had a student from that class who you know, noticed that I was a writer, kind of went online and read the essay I was just telling you guys about my sister, which is on the Oregon Humanities magazine. And then he's like, wow, like that, your life is like my life was, you know, and he's a student that's in recovery, and he's trying to come back from a lot of barriers. And so he went and bought my book, and he's been sending me little updates as he gets through it. So I think it's just so cool when you feel that connection.
Right. What advice do you have for any writers that are in the audience who are looking to get their work published?
I honestly have no idea. You know, when I was in my MFA program, it felt like most of the people were there just to try to get published, and they weren't there to really just learn about writing as a craft. And I remember once, you know, every now and again, they'll have somebody from publishing come and give a talk. And they had Hawthorne Press was there. Oh my gosh, I'm totally blanking. And we knew each other, like from me working in the bookstore. But it was funny to see how my fellow students would sort of like hound these publishing people, and they didn't even have books written yet, right? They just really wanted to be published. Their books weren't written yet. And so I remember at one point, we were in conversation, and so the other students got the idea that like I knew this person. And so then they're like, oh, can you help us get your book published? And I remember saying, you know, you guys, if you want your book to be published, like think of publishing as like an ecosystem. And if you're not an organism that's contributing to it, an ecosystem will like kick you out, right? So you need to be like, what are you going to contribute to your literary community? And what relationships are you making? Because, you know, I have a lot of authors that come in the bookstore. You guys do, I know, who will come in the bookstore with their self-published books. And it's funny, Renee, because Curtis, you know, when he was hounding me for the manuscript, I'm like, no, I'm not going to be an author trying to force people to read my book. And he's like, Tina, people want to read it. And I was like, oh, and you know how often you have to say, oh, that sounds beautiful. Can you write something up? Can you, I can't stop what I'm doing right now to hear about your book. But, you know, but can you write something up and drop it off for me, and I'll consider it when I have time. And but it's interesting how few of those people buy books at your bookstore, you know, and they want you to help them, but they want, you know, they are more concerned with their prime points or whatever they get, right? And so I remember telling those friends of mine, like, you guys should be like at your local bookstore. You should be at every event. You should be spending your money there and supporting them, because you're going to hope that they're going to give you an event like this someday, or you know, whatever your local literary community is. How can you get involved? How can you contribute? How can you have citizenship in that community before you ask something of it?
Those are very wise words, and we are almost out of time. So I want to thank you, Tina, for sharing so much of yourself here with us today, and also in your book, Rough House, which there is going to be a link appearing in your chat screen very soon. And Renee, thank you also for, you know, sharing with us things that you haven't shared with anybody else before. So I appreciate both of you. I am so proud to be able to call you both fellow booksellers and friends. And one day soon, we're all going to get together. We're going to just go out, have a nice glass of wine or coffee or something, and actually get to talk about this book in person. I want to thank our audience for spending this evening with us and sharing in this mutual love of literature. And thank you all for joining us, and have a lovely night.
Thank you, Grace.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Grace.
Tina.
Thank you, Renee. Good night.
Good night.
Bye.
Guys. Good night, Abby. Good night, Mom. Good night, Sharon.